The first thing my boss said before firing me was, "People like you are replaceable." The second thing he said was, "Security will escort you out." What he didn't know was that 48 hours later, every executive in the company would sit in absolute silence while his entire career collapsed in front of them. But before we get into that disaster, follow for more corporate revenge stories, workplace drama, malicious compliance, and endings where arrogant people finally meet consequences. My name is Evelyn Mercer, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I was Director of Supply Chain Operations at Harborstone Industrial Systems. At least, that's what everyone believed. Harborstone manufactured electrical systems for hospitals, airports, and commercial buildings, the kind of company nobody notices until something fails and entire projects suddenly stop working. I'd worked there for 11 years, long enough to know which suppliers could be trusted, long enough to know which executives actually understood the business, and, unfortunately, long enough to watch Derek Vaughan slowly turn the company into a disaster waiting to happen. Derek became COO 8 months earlier, and the board loved him immediately. Of course they did. Men like Derek were designed perfectly for corporate leadership. Expensive suits, perfect smile, endless confidence, and every sentence sounded like a motivational LinkedIn post written by somebody who had never solved a real problem in their life. Operational efficiency, lean restructuring, margin acceleration. The executives practically applauded every time he spoke. Then, profits started rising, and suddenly, everyone treated Derek like a genius. But I knew exactly how those numbers were improving, because I was the one cleaning up the damage behind the scenes. You can make almost any company look profitable for a few quarters if you stop replacing equipment, delay maintenance, reduce inspections, pressure suppliers into impossible pricing, force employees to work around broken systems while pretending everything is fine. Derek's strategy was simple. Make the numbers look amazing now. Let someone else deal with the disaster later. Unfortunately for him, I documented everything. Every rejected safety recommendation, every supplier complaint, every delayed repair, every warning from engineering teams begging leadership to slow down before something failed catastrophically. Derek hated that. Not because I was wrong, because I wouldn't stay quiet. "You always resist progress," he snapped during one executive meeting after I rejected one of his supplier proposals. The room went silent immediately. I looked down at the vendor report in front of me. 3 active lawsuits, multiple defect investigations, and somehow Derek still wanted to trust them with critical infrastructure components. "That supplier has one of the worst reliability records I've ever seen," I said calmly. Derek leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You're too emotionally attached to old systems." "No," I replied. "I'm attached to keeping hospitals from losing backup power." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Derek's smile disappeared instantly. That was the thing about Derek. He loved confidence, until someone challenged his. After that meeting, things changed. I stopped getting invited to certain executive discussions. Budget approvals became harder. My department started receiving surprise audits. And suddenly, every operational problem somehow became my fault. Delayed shipment? Operations issue. Supplier defect? Operations issue. Equipment failures caused by canceled maintenance? Still somehow operations, meaning me. By month 3, Derek had developed a favorite phrase. "Evelyn creates unnecessary resistance." He repeated it constantly, usually right before ignoring another warning. At first, I thought he was just arrogant. Then I realized something worse. He genuinely believed he was smarter than everyone around him. And people like that are dangerous, especially when nobody ever tells them no. The final argument happened on a Tuesday afternoon during a quarterly review meeting. I walked into the conference room carrying a 30-page report detailing product failures, supplier defects, and warranty claims tied directly to Derek's cost-cutting decisions. The moment I entered, I knew something was wrong. 2 HR representatives were already seated inside. Neither would look at me. Derek sat calmly at the far end of the table with his hands folded, and beside him was a termination folder, prepared before I even arrived. Then Derek smiled, and that's when I realized this idiot had absolutely no idea who he was firing. For a second, nobody in the conference room said anything. The air smelled like burnt coffee and overheated electronics from the wall monitor behind Derek. My 30-page operations report still glowed on the screen. Defect percentages, supplier complaints, warranty claims, a roadmap of every terrible decision Derek had spent 8 months forcing through the company. And now it sat behind him like evidence at a trial he didn't realize was already happening. Derek folded his hands calmly, almost casually, like he practiced this conversation in the mirror beforehand. "Thank you for coming, Evelyn," he said. One of the HR representatives shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The other kept staring at the table. I slowly placed my report down. "What's this?" I asked, even though I already knew. Derek smiled. "The company has decided to move in a different direction." Corporate language was fascinating. Executives could disguise almost any stupid decision if they wrapped it in polished phrasing. I glanced toward the termination folder again. Already signed, already processed, effective immediately. So this had been planned for a while. Interesting. "And what direction is that exactly?" I asked calmly. Derek leaned back in his chair. "A more efficient one." There it was again. Efficient, his favorite word. To Derek, efficiency meant cutting corners until something exploded, then blaming somebody else afterward. "You've consistently resisted strategic initiatives," he continued. "Every operational adjustment becomes an argument." "Because your operational adjustments keep creating failures," I replied. One HR rep inhaled sharply. Derek's jaw tightened immediately. "You see," he said, gesturing toward me like I was proving his point. "This attitude is exactly the problem." I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, because Derek genuinely believed confidence was the same thing as competence. He thought sounding authoritative automatically made him correct. Meanwhile, half the company was quietly cleaning up disasters he created every week. I opened the report in front of me and flipped to the supplier section. "The Westgate components failed inspection 3 times, I said calmly. "Engineering recommended termination of the contract 2 months ago." "And yet production continued," Derek replied. "Yes, because you overrode the recommendation personally." The room went silent again. Derek smiled tightly. "Business requires difficult decisions." "No," I said. "Bad leadership creates difficult recoveries." One of the HR reps looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Derek slowly leaned forward now. And for the first time since I entered the room, the fake executive smile disappeared completely. "You've become disruptive," he said quietly. There it was. Not incompetent, not ineffective. Disruptive. Because I kept documenting everything. Because I refused to stay quiet while he dismantled systems that had protected the company for decades. "You pushed defective components into hospital contracts," I said. "You delayed maintenance replacements. You cut QA staffing below minimum recommendations." "You're exaggerating." "I have the reports." "You have opinions." That one irritated me. Not visibly, but internally. Because men like Derek always called facts opinions, the second facts became inconvenient. I folded my hands calmly. "You're going to hurt this company." Derek actually laughed. Then he picked up the termination folder beside him and slid it slowly across the table toward me. "I think," he said, "the company will survive without your negativity." The folder stopped directly in front of me. Failure to align with leadership objectives. Cause for termination. Effective immediately. I stared at the paper for several seconds, not shocked, not angry, mostly fascinated. Because this idiot truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. "I'm serious," Derek said. "I know." "You're terminated effective today." I looked up at him. Then I smiled. And that confused him instantly. He expected panic, or bargaining, or outrage. Men like Derek loved emotional reactions because they mistook emotional control for power. Instead, I just sat there smiling at him calmly. That uncertainty lasted only a second before his ego recovered. "Security will escort you out," he added coldly. "That won't be necessary." I stood slowly and picked up my phone and notebook. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The HR reps looked horrified now, like they sensed something was wrong but didn't understand what. As I reached the conference room door, Derek said one final thing. "People like you are replaceable." That almost made me laugh out loud, because there was one very important detail Derek Vaughn never bothered learning before firing me. Harborstone Industrial Systems wasn't publicly owned, and technically, neither was he. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time since the meeting started, I finally let myself smile. Not because I'd just been fired, because Derek Vaughn had made the single worst mistake of his career without even realizing it. Beside me, a young intern awkwardly adjusted the stack of folders in his arms while pretending not to stare. Apparently, my termination had already spread through the building. Corporate gossip moved faster than fiber-optic internet. My phone buzzed before the elevator even reached the parking garage, then again, and again. By the time the doors opened, I already had 12 messages waiting. Most came from department managers, a few from engineers, one from a supervisor in quality assurance. Every single message asked the same thing in different ways. What happened? I ignored them for now. Instead, I walked calmly through the underground garage toward my car while replaying the meeting in my head. Not the firing itself. That part honestly didn't bother me. It was the confidence Derek had while doing it. That fascinated me, because nobody with actual power behaves the way Derek did. Real authority rarely needs performance. But Derek treated leadership like theater. Every conversation was a performance, every meeting was a stage, and every employee existed solely as supporting characters in the fantasy where he was always the smartest person in the room. Unfortunately for him, he'd finally fired someone who knew exactly how fragile that fantasy really was. I reached my car and tossed my notebook into the passenger seat. Then my phone rang again. This time I answered. "Nathan," I said. My attorney immediately spoke without greeting me first. "You sound entertained." "I just got fired." Silence. Then, "You're joking." "By Derek Vaughn." Another pause, a much longer one this time. Finally, Nathan exhaled slowly. "That may actually be the dumbest executive decision I've ever heard." "I'm starting to think so too." Nathan began laughing. Not politely either, full, uncontrolled laughter. I leaned against the side of my car while he recovered. "You know," he said finally, "most people react differently after losing their jobs. Most people don't technically own the company." That shut him up immediately. Harborstone Industrial Systems wasn't publicly traded. Most employees assumed it operated like every other corporate manufacturing company. Board members, executives, investors. But Harborstone was actually controlled through layered ownership structures tied to a single majority trust. Renfield Capital. created by my grandfather almost 40 years earlier, after he acquired Harborstone during a recession. After his death, controlling ownership transferred quietly through family succession. To me. Not publicly, not operationally, and definitely not advertised inside the company. I preferred it that way. People behaved honestly around you when they thought you were ordinary. Derek apparently never bothered reviewing the company's shareholder structure before deciding to fire senior leadership, which felt irresponsible for a COO. "You're removing him," Nathan said calmly now. "I haven't decided yet. You called me less than 10 minutes after getting terminated. That doesn't prove anything." "You're smiling, Evelyn." I looked back up at Harborstone's headquarters towering above the garage. Several office windows still glowed on the executive floor. One of them belonged to Derek. He was probably celebrating right now. Probably telling executives he'd finally eliminated the resistance slowing him down. The thought almost made me laugh again. "I gave him 8 months," I said quietly. Nathan stopped joking immediately. That tone got his attention. He ignored safety reports, forced defective vendors through approval, buried maintenance requests, threatened managers who pushed back. "How bad are we talking?" "Bad enough that eventually somebody gets hurt." Silence again, because that changed everything. Corporate arrogance was one thing, safety negligence was another, especially in industrial manufacturing, especially involving hospitals and government contracts. Nathan lowered his voice. "What do you need from me?" "Board attendance confirmations for Thursday." "You're serious?" "Completely." "And operational records?" "The last 3 quarters." Nathan exhaled slowly. Then he asked the question I already knew was coming. "Does Derek know who you are?" I looked up at the glowing executive windows again. "No," I said calmly. "And I think I'd like to keep it that way for another 48 hours. Nathan laughed quietly. "Oh, this is going to be catastrophic." I opened my car door. "No," I replied. "For him, it's going to be educational." Then I ended the call, and upstairs, somewhere inside that building, Derek Vaughn was still celebrating the fact he thought he'd won. Wednesday morning felt strange. Not emotional, not devastating, just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens right before something explodes. By 7:30 a.m., my phone was already vibrating non-stop on the kitchen counter. Messages, emails, missed calls. Word spread through Harborstone fast after my firing. Apparently faster than Derek expected. Managers from production started reaching out first, then engineers, then supervisors. Some were confused, others sounded genuinely angry. But almost every message carried the same underlying question. Why would Derek fire the one person constantly stopping disasters from happening? That answer became obvious pretty quickly. Because now that I was gone, people inside the company were finally starting to panic. The first anonymous email arrived before breakfast. No subject line, no message, just photos attached. Maintenance equipment covered in rust. Machines overdue for replacement. Safety inspection stickers months past expiration dates. Every repair request in the photos had one thing in common: denied by Derek Vaughn. The next email included screenshots from internal engineering discussions. One sentence stood out immediately. "We are approaching critical failure risk." I read that line 3 times. Then I opened the attached files. Component defects, heat stress fractures, emergency shutdown concerns, and every warning traced back to the same suppliers Derek forced into approval after slashing costs. I leaned back slowly in my chair. because this wasn't normal executive incompetence anymore. This was the kind of negligence that destroyed companies permanently. My phone rang again. Nathan. "You seeing these emails?" he asked immediately. "Yes." "How many employees hate this man exactly?" "At this point, possibly all of them." Nathan laughed quietly. Then his tone changed. "I pulled board confirmations for Thursday." "And?" "Everyone's attending." "Perfect." Thursday's shareholder meeting was supposed to be routine. Quarterly projections, operational reviews, financial summaries. Instead, it was rapidly turning into Derek Vaughn's public execution. Nathan lowered his voice. "There's another problem." That got my attention instantly. "What happened?" "Derek's moving fast." "How fast?" "He approved another supplier transition this morning." I already knew where this was going before Nathan even said the name. "Blackridge?" A pause. "Yeah." I closed my eyes. Of course it was Blackridge. The supplier Harborstone blacklisted years earlier after catastrophic component failures. Cheap overseas manufacturing, false certifications, multiple lawsuits. Even discussing them internally used to trigger arguments. And now Derek was trying to push them into active production. Why? Because they were cheaper. That's all he cared about. Quarterly numbers, temporary profits, executive bonuses. People like Derek always believed consequences were future problems, and future problems belonged to somebody else. Unfortunately for him, that future had arrived much sooner than expected. "You know what this means, right?" Nathan asked carefully. "Yes." "If Blackridge components fail inside government or hospital contracts," "I know." "The legal exposure alone could destroy Harborstone, not to mention the investigations, the lawsuits, the public fallout. And Derek still thought firing me solved his problems. That part almost impressed me. The level of confidence required to be this reckless was honestly extraordinary. Another email notification appeared on my screen. This one from someone in quality assurance. Attached were internal audit screenshots showing Derek personally overriding failed inspection recommendations. Again, and again, and again. I stared at the approvals silently, because suddenly something became very clear. Derek didn't think rules applied to him anymore. That was the real danger. Not arrogance, not ego, certainty. The kind of certainty powerful people develop when nobody has forced them to face consequences in a very long time. Nathan interrupted my thoughts. "So what's the plan?" I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Far in the distance, Harborstone's headquarters tower reflected the gray morning sky. Somewhere inside that building, Derek was probably celebrating, probably bragging about finally eliminating the resistance slowing him down. And tomorrow morning, he was going to walk into a boardroom believing he was still in control. "I want every operational report printed for Thursday," I said calmly. "All of them?" "All of them." Nathan hesitated. Then he laughed softly. "Oh, this is going to ruin him." I kept staring at the Harborstone building. "No," I said quietly. "He ruined himself." The only difference was, tomorrow everyone else was finally going to see it too. Thursday morning arrived cold, gray, and completely silent. The kind of weather that made the entire city feel tense. Perfect, honestly. I parked across from Harborstone headquarters just before 8 a.m. and sat inside my car watching employees hurry through the revolving front doors, clutching coffee cups and laptops. Most of them had no idea what was about to happen upstairs. A few probably suspected, but nobody knew the full story yet, not even the board. My phone buzzed. Nathan. "They're all here," he said immediately. "Derek?" "Arrived 20 minutes ago." I smiled faintly. "Early." Of course he did. Men like Derek loved arriving early to important meetings. It made them feel powerful. "Anything interesting?" I asked. Nathan laughed softly. He's celebrating. That almost made me laugh too. Apparently, Derek spent the last hour walking around the executive floor, acting like he'd just saved Harborstone from collapse. According to Marcus, he even told senior leadership that removing me was the final step toward operational modernization. Corporate executives really would say absolutely anything with enough confidence. "And the board?" I asked. "Nervous." Good. They should be nervous. Because once they saw the reports Nathan prepared, panic was going to replace nervousness very quickly. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my coat. Across the street, Harborstone towered above the financial district like a monument to expensive mistakes. 11 years inside that building. 11 years fixing problems quietly, while executives took credit for stability they barely understood. And somehow, Derek convinced himself I was disposable. The funny part? That was probably the first truly honest mistake he'd made all year. Because Derek didn't understand Harborstone at all. Not really. He understood numbers, presentations, quarterly optics. But he didn't understand the actual machinery holding the company together. The people, the systems, the relationships built over decades. And most importantly, he never understood who was actually watching him. Inside the lobby, conversations stopped briefly when I walked in. Not dramatically, just enough. Receptionists glanced up. Managers froze mid-conversation. Someone near the elevators whispered my name quietly. Interesting. Rumors had clearly evolved overnight. The security guard at the front desk looked especially uncomfortable, which made sense. Derek apparently instructed security to escort me out 2 days earlier. Now I was calmly walking back inside like nothing happened. "Morning, Daniel," I said politely. The guard blinked twice before nodding nervously. "Morning, Ms. Mercer." He didn't stop me. Of course he didn't. Nobody actually knew what authority I technically had inside the building. Not publicly. But people sensed things. And right now, the entire atmosphere inside Harborstone felt wrong. Like employees could tell some invisible shift was happening beneath the surface. The elevator ride to the executive floor was painfully quiet. 3 vice presidents stood inside with me. None of them spoke. One actually stepped aside when the doors opened, silently allowing me to exit first. Fear. Interesting again. By the time I reached the boardroom hallway, Nathan was already waiting outside holding a thick stack of folders. "That's dramatic," I said, eyeing the mountain of paperwork. "You said print everything." "Fair point." Nathan handed me the top folder. Inside were operational reports, maintenance failures, vendor overrides, inspection records, and internal warnings spanning 8 months. Every signature highlighted, every approval timestamped, every dangerous decision connected directly back to Derek Vaughn. Looking at the stack honestly felt surreal. One reckless executive had nearly destabilized an entire company in less than a year. And somehow, he still thought he was untouchable. Voices echoed faintly from inside the boardroom. Derek was already talking. Confident, relaxed. Probably giving some polished speech about efficiency and modernization. Nathan glanced toward the closed doors. "He still doesn't know?" "No." "You want to tell him before we go in?" I actually considered it for a second. Not because Derek deserved a warning, because part of me wondered whether seeing his face in real time would be worth the surprise. Then I shook my head. "No," I said calmly. "I think I'd rather watch him figure it out himself." Nathan smiled slowly. "That's cold." "Not really." I looked down at the shareholder packet resting on top of the folder stack. Renfield Capital Trust, Majority Ownership Authority, Beneficial Owner, Evelyn Mercer. Then I reached for the boardroom door handle. And inside that room, Derek Vaughn was still smiling. The moment I opened the boardroom door, every conversation inside stopped. Instantly. Executives who'd been casually discussing quarterly projections suddenly went silent the second they saw me walk in beside Nathan. At the far end of the room, Derek Vaughn looked up from his seat near the presentation screen and smiled. At first. Because for one beautiful moment, he genuinely thought I was there to beg for my job back. I could actually see the confidence on his face, the superiority, the assumption that he'd already won. Then his eyes shifted toward the folders in Nathan's hands, then toward the attorneys seated beside the board members, and finally, to the chair I pulled out at the head of the table. That's when his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. A slight tightening around the eyes, confusion. Good. I sat calmly while Nathan distributed the shareholder packets around the room. Nobody spoke during it. Several executives looked uncomfortable already. Marcus Reed avoided eye contact completely. One board member slowly adjusted his glasses while staring at the cover page in front of him. Derek cleared his throat first. "Evelyn," he said carefully, forcing a smile. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending." "You should have been," I replied. Silence again. Derek's attention dropped to the document sitting in front of him. Renfield Capital Trust, majority controlling interest, beneficial owner, Evelyn Mercer. For several seconds he didn't react. Honestly, I don't think his brain processed it immediately. Then the color slowly drained from his face. He looked back up at me, then at the packet again. "This," he started quietly. Nobody helped him finish. One board member leaned back slowly and muttered, "Oh my God." Another executive coughed to hide what sounded suspiciously like laughter. Derek swallowed hard, and suddenly the confident executive who fired me 2 days earlier looked very, very small. Nathan stepped forward calmly. "Before today's agenda begins, Ms. Mercer requested discussion regarding operational negligence and executive misconduct." Derek looked around the room quickly. "This is clearly some kind of misunderstanding." "No," I said softly. "It really isn't." The room stayed silent. Not supportive silence. The kind people create when they realize someone powerful just made a catastrophic mistake in public. Derek tried recovering immediately. People like him always did. "If I'd known—" "That's exactly the problem," I interrupted calmly. His mouth closed instantly. Because there was no defense for this. Harborstone's COO had fired the controlling owner of the company without even understanding who he was talking to. And now every person in the room knew it. Nathan opened the first folder. "Over the last 8 months," he began, "Mr. Vaughn approved multiple vendor overrides against engineering recommendations, reduced maintenance expenditures below operational minimums, and bypassed standard quality assurance procedures." Each sentence landed harder than the last. Derek straightened in his chair. "These decisions improved operational performance." Nathan slid several reports across the table. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why defect claims increased 42% under your supervision." Derek grabbed the papers too quickly. That tiny loss of composure told everyone what they needed to know. Board members started flipping through pages silently. Maintenance failures, supplier complaints, inspection overrides, internal warnings, and Derek's signature attached to nearly all of it. Again, and again, and again. Marcus finally spoke. "The Blackridge proposal alone could expose Harborstone to massive liability." Derek snapped toward him. "That projection is exaggerated." "No," Marcus replied coldly. "If anything, it's conservative." That one hurt him. I could tell. Because Derek was used to controlling rooms through confidence. But confidence stops working once evidence enters the conversation, and the evidence against him was becoming impossible to ignore. Then Nathan placed one final document in front of the board: wrongful termination exposure. specifically involving termination of majority ownership representation without governance review. One board member stared at Derek in disbelief. "You fired her?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. They didn't need to, because Derek's face already had. And for the first time since I'd known him, Derek Vaughn looked afraid. The fear on Derek's face lasted less than 10 seconds. Then his ego recovered. Honestly, I almost admired the speed of it. Men like Derek survived corporate environments by refusing to believe consequences were real until they physically hit them. So instead of accepting reality, he doubled down. "This is ridiculous," he said suddenly, forcing a laugh. "You're turning operational disagreements into personal attacks." Nobody answered. That silence hurt him more than any argument could have, because Derek expected support, or at least hesitation. Instead, every person in the room kept reading the reports in front of them. Supplier failures, maintenance delays, internal warnings, financial exposure analyses, all tied directly back to him. And worse, nobody looked surprised. Several board members looked disturbed, a few looked angry, but not shocked, which meant they already suspected something was wrong long before today. They just didn't realize how bad it actually was. Derek turned toward Marcus. "You approved these budgets too." Marcus didn't even look up. "I approve them based on your operational assurances." That landed hard. I saw Derek's jaw tighten immediately, because now the room was shifting against him, fast. Nathan calmly opened another folder. "There's also the matter of the Black Ridge proposal." Several board members looked up instantly at the name. Good. That reaction alone told me they understood exactly how dangerous Black Ridge was. Derek recovered quickly. "Black Ridge offers substantial cost reductions and catastrophic reliability history," I replied. "We haven't finalized implementation." "No," Marcus said coldly, "because engineering caught the issue first." Derek looked around the room again, still searching for allies, still believing confidence alone could save him. Then he made the mistake that finally destroyed him. He got angry. "You're all overreacting," he snapped. "Every modernization effort faces resistance from employees afraid of change." Employees. Interesting word choice. Not leadership, not executives. Employees. Because in Derek's mind, everyone beneath him existed on the same level. Replaceable, disposable, including me. One older board member slowly removed his glasses. "Did you review governance structure before terminating Ms. Mercer?" Derek hesitated. Tiny mistake, but everyone noticed it. "I followed standard executive procedure." That wasn't the question. Now the room felt different, sharper, dangerous. Derek finally realized he wasn't controlling the conversation anymore. And once people like him lose control, they unravel quickly. Nathan slid another document across the table. "This is the legal exposure analysis regarding Ms. Mercer's termination." One board member skimmed the page and immediately swore under his breath. Another leaned forward slowly. "You terminated majority ownership representation without board review?" For the first time all morning, Derek's confidence visibly cracked. "I wasn't informed about ownership structure." "You're the COO," Marcus said flatly. "You were expected to inform yourself." That one hurt him badly, because Marcus rarely sounded emotional, but now there was genuine disgust in his voice. Derek noticed it too, and suddenly panic started replacing arrogance. He looked at me again, really looked at me this time, like he was trying to understand how the woman he dismissed 2 days earlier was now sitting calmly at the head of the table while his career collapsed around him. "I think this situation has escalated unnecessarily," he said carefully. I almost laughed. Unnecessarily. Like this was some unfortunate misunderstanding instead of 8 months of reckless leadership. "You threatened engineers," I said calmly. His eyes snapped toward me. "You buried safety warnings." "That's not—" "You approved defective suppliers for hospital infrastructure." "I made operational decisions." "You fired the one executive documenting all of it." That ended the room completely. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because now the truth sat openly in the middle of the table where everyone could finally see it. This wasn't restructuring. This wasn't modernization. This was negligence. Dangerous negligence. And Derek finally understood something horrifying. The people around him weren't deciding whether he made mistakes anymore. They were deciding how much damage he caused before getting caught. Nathan quietly closed the final folder. Then one board member spoke. "I believe we should move to immediate removal proceedings." The room stayed silent for half a second. Then another voice answered, "Agreed." Then another, and another. Derek looked frozen now, actually frozen, like his brain physically couldn't process what was happening. And for the first time since I'd met him, Derek Vaughn had absolutely nothing to say. The emergency vote took less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's all it took to destroy the career Derek Vaughn spent 20 years building. Nobody defended him. Not one person. Honestly, I think that shocked him more than the evidence did. Because people like Derek always assume fear equals loyalty. But fear only lasts until consequences arrive. And once the room realized how dangerous his decisions actually were, everybody started protecting themselves instead. The board chair cleared his throat. "All in favor of immediate termination of Derek Vaughn as Chief Operating Officer?" Hands went up around the table almost instantly, one after another. Calm, efficient, final. Derek looked around the room in disbelief, like he genuinely expected someone to stop this. Someone didn't. The vote was unanimous. Not a single objection, not even an abstention. The silence afterward felt heavier than the shouting earlier, because now it was over. Nathan calmly slid the termination paperwork across the table toward Derek. The exact same motion Derek used on me 48 hours earlier. That part almost felt poetic. Derek stared at the papers without touching them. His face looked pale now, not angry anymore, just stunned. Finally, he looked at me. "This is retaliation." I almost smiled. "No," I replied calmly. "This is accountability." That hit harder than I expected, because Derek looked away immediately after I said it. Like deep down, somewhere underneath the arrogance and panic, he knew I was right. One board member leaned forward. "Effective immediately, your executive access is revoked pending legal review." Another added, "You are not authorized to contact vendors, clients, or internal staff regarding operational matters." Derek blinked slowly. "You're serious?" Nobody answered. Again, they didn't need to. The board chair pressed a button beneath the conference table. A few seconds later, the boardroom doors opened, and Daniel stepped inside. The same security guard Derek instructed to escort me out 2 days earlier. For a second, even Daniel looked uncomfortable. Honestly, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Derek noticed him too. And suddenly the humiliation became real. Not theoretical. Not legal. Personal. "You've got to be kidding me," Derek muttered quietly. Nobody laughed. Daniel shifted awkwardly. "Sir," he started carefully. Derek stood up so abruptly his chair rolled backward across the floor. "This is insane," he snapped. "You're making a catastrophic mistake." Interesting. Even now, he still thought he was the victim. Marcus finally looked at him directly for the first time all morning. "No, Derek," he said quietly. "The catastrophic mistake was letting you stay this long." That one finished him. You could actually see it happen. The last bit of executive confidence disappeared from his face completely. Now he just looked tired and scared. Derek grabbed the termination paperwork off the table aggressively before shoving it into his briefcase. Then he looked at me one final time. "This company needs people willing to make hard decisions." I held his stare calmly. "Hard decisions protect companies," I replied. "Your decisions protected quarterly bonuses." Several executives looked down immediately after that, because everybody knew it was true. Derek opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then stopped. Probably because there wasn't anything left to say anymore. Daniel stepped aside toward the doorway. Derek walked past him stiffly, without another word. The room stayed silent while he disappeared down the hallway. No dramatic speeches, no final outburst. Just the sound of expensive dress shoes fading into the distance while an entire career collapsed behind them. And somehow, that silence felt far more brutal than yelling ever could. A few seconds later, Marcus exhaled heavily and leaned back in his chair. "Well," he muttered, "that was horrifying." One board member actually laughed nervously. Another rubbed both hands across his face like he'd aged 10 years during the meeting. Then all eyes slowly turned toward me. Not fearful, not hostile, careful. Because now they understood something they hadn't fully realized before. I hadn't just exposed Derek. I'd been quietly protecting Harborstone from him for months, maybe longer. The board chair adjusted his tie. "There's going to be fallout from this." "Yes," I said calmly. "There is." And unfortunately, the fallout was already starting. Because while everyone inside that room believed Derek Vaughn was finished, none of us realized yet how dangerous desperate people could become once they had nothing left to lose. 3 days later, my name was everywhere. Business blogs, industry forums, corporate gossip pages, even finance accounts that normally posted stock updates suddenly had opinions about Harborstone Industrial Systems. And according to the internet, I was apparently some kind of corrupt corporate mastermind. The first article appeared Saturday morning. Anonymous sources reveal internal Harborstone power struggle. By noon, several other sites copied the story. Then, the accusations started. Hidden ownership, executive manipulation, nepotism, secret influence over operations. Internal documents began leaking online almost immediately afterward. Carefully selected documents, not enough to tell the truth, just enough to create suspicion. And honestly, it worked, at least temporarily. By Sunday evening, my phone looked like a disaster zone. Missed calls from reporters, messages from board members, emails from investors demanding explanations. One headline described me as a shadow executive secretly controlling Harborstone from within, which honestly sounded far more impressive than reality. Nathan arrived at my apartment carrying takeout and a legal folder thick enough to qualify as a weapon. "You look calm," he said carefully. "I'm exhausted." "That's worse." Fair point. I muted another news notification and tossed my phone onto the couch. "Derek?" I asked. Nathan nodded immediately. "Has to be." The timing was too perfect. The leaks started less than 48 hours after his removal, and whoever released them understood exactly how to manipulate public opinion. Not direct lies, distorted truths, the most dangerous kind. Nathan dropped the folder onto my kitchen counter. We identified several leaked files only executive leadership could access. So he copied documents before termination. Looks that way. I leaned silently against the counter, because this changed everything. Up until now, Derek's damage stayed mostly internal. Operational failures, financial exposure, corporate negligence. But public scandal? That threatened investors, contracts, government relationships, trust. And desperate executives often preferred destruction over accountability. Nathan opened the folder. "There's more." That sentence was becoming a problem lately. What now? One of the HR reps contacted me privately. That got my attention immediately. The firing meeting? Nathan nodded. She claims Derek pressured them to bypass standard termination review procedures. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Harborstone governance policy required legal review before removing certain executive positions, especially ones connected to shareholder representation. Meaning Derek ignored protocol completely. Not surprising, but legally, very useful. Nathan flipped through another document. She also claims Derek ordered portions of maintenance escalation records removed from internal archives. I stared at him. Removed? He apparently thought deleting complaints would reduce liability exposure. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was unbelievably stupid. Destroying records during an internal investigation? That crossed the line from arrogance into panic, and panic made people careless. My phone buzzed again. "Marcus." I answered immediately. "You need to see this," he said. "Please tell me nobody leaked more documents." "It's worse." That got my attention fast. Marcus lowered his voice. "Employees are talking publicly now." I frowned. "What do you mean, publicly?" Engineering staff started posting screenshots online. And suddenly, Derek's situation became much, much worse. "Screenshots of what?" I asked immediately. Marcus exhaled heavily on the other end of the line. "Emails, inspection reports, vendor warnings, internal approvals." Nathan looked up from the kitchen counter the second he saw my expression change. "That bad?" he mouthed silently. Worse. Because Harborstone employees had stayed quiet for months. Fear does that. People protect their jobs, their health care, their families. But Derek losing power changed the balance completely. Now employees felt safe enough to speak, and apparently, they'd been saving receipts the entire time. Marcus lowered his voice. One engineering manager posted proof Derek ignored defect warnings tied to emergency backup systems. My stomach tightened instantly. Hospitals, airports, government buildings. Exactly the contracts we warned him about repeatedly. "Is it spreading?" I asked. Marcus laughed once. Not because it was funny, because the situation had already gone beyond containment. "Evelyn, it's everywhere." I closed my eyes briefly, because now Derek's strategy was collapsing in real time. He thought leaking selective documents would create confusion, maybe pressure the board into backing away quietly. Instead, he accidentally triggered something much worse. Employees started fighting back publicly. And unlike Derek, the employees telling the truth had evidence. time-stamped emails, internal reports, approval chains, everything. Nathan's phone buzzed beside him. He checked the screen, then looked up slowly. "Well," he muttered, "that escalated quickly." "What happened?" He turned the phone toward me. A federal investigation involving Black Ridge Manufacturing had officially become public. My chest tightened immediately. Because Black Ridge wasn't just under suspicion anymore. Federal investigators were examining falsified component certifications tied to infrastructure contracts. Exactly what engineering warned about. Exactly what Derek ignored. And suddenly, this stopped being corporate drama. This became potential federal exposure. Nathan sat down across from me slowly. If Derek finalized those supplier contracts, I know. Harborstone could have been dragged directly into a fraud investigation. Government audits, civil lawsuits, contract suspensions. The company might not have survived it. Marcus spoke again through the phone. "There's something else." Of course there was. One of the board members spoke to reporters anonymously. I frowned. What did they say? That Derek was removed for operational negligence and governance violations. Interesting. Very interesting. Because now the narrative was shifting publicly, fast. The story wasn't about secret ownership anymore. Now it was about a reckless executive trying to destroy the company after getting caught. Nathan leaned back in his chair. "I don't think Derek understands how bad this is becoming." "No," I said quietly. "I really don't think he does." And honestly, part of me almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because up until now, Derek still believed this was a corporate fight, a reputation problem, something he could outmaneuver with confidence and media pressure. But federal investigators didn't care about executive charisma. Neither did financial auditors, or deleted records, or leaked narratives. They cared about evidence, and Derek had left evidence everywhere. Marcus interrupted my thoughts. "There's one more thing you need to know." I stared out the apartment window toward the city lights. "What now?" "He's blaming you internally." That made me pause. "How?" "He's telling people you orchestrated everything to remove him." Nathan, but Marcus didn't. Because Derek people were dangerous, and Derek Vaughn was running out of options very quickly. Then Marcus said the sentence that made my entire body go still. "Evelyn, legal just confirmed Derek accessed restricted files after termination." The apartment went completely silent. Because that wasn't corporate misconduct anymore. That was criminal. The apartment stayed silent for several seconds after Marcus said it. Restricted files. After termination. That wasn't desperation anymore. That was panic. Nathan sat forward immediately. "Are we talking copied files or active access?" Marcus answered quietly through the phone. "Both." My stomach tightened, because Harborstone's internal systems tracked everything. Login times, remote access, file transfers, deleted records. If Derek accessed protected company systems after being removed, there would be a digital trail. And judging by Marcus's tone, the trail was probably ugly. "When?" I asked. "Late Saturday night." Interesting. Right around the same time the leaks started appearing online. Nathan was already opening his laptop beside me. "Tell IT not to touch anything," he said immediately. "No resets, no cleanup. Preserve all logs." They already isolated the accounts, Marcus replied. Good. At least somebody inside Harborstone was thinking clearly now. I leaned back slowly and stared at the ceiling, because suddenly the entire situation shifted again. Before this, Derek still had some room to argue. Bad leadership, poor judgment, reckless decision-making, but unauthorized access after termination? That crossed into something much more serious. Nathan looked up from his screen. He used a secondary executive credential. I frowned. How? Probably never surrendered all his access permissions, which honestly tracked perfectly with Derek's personality. Rules were for other people, procedures were obstacles, consequences were temporary inconveniences, until suddenly they weren't. Marcus exhaled heavily through the speaker. It gets worse. Of course it did. One of the deleted folders involved federal contract documentation. That sentence changed the entire atmosphere instantly. Nathan stopped typing. I stopped breathing for about half a second, because federal contract records carried different regulations entirely, different penalties too. Was anything removed? I asked carefully. We don't know yet. That was bad. Very bad. Nathan closed his laptop slowly. If investigators connect deleted records to an active federal inquiry... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Obstruction, evidence tampering, possible fraud exposure. The kind of allegations that ended careers permanently. And Derek still probably believed he was the victim somehow. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but nothing about this situation was normal anymore. I picked up. Ms. Mercer? Male voice, older, professional. Yes? This is Special Agent Collins with the Department of Infrastructure Oversight. Well, that escalated quickly. Nathan immediately sat upright across from me. Agent Collins continued calmly. We'd like to schedule a conversation regarding Harborstone's prior vendor approval discussions involving Black Ridge Manufacturing. Straight to the point. Interesting. Am I under investigation? I asked. No, ma'am. At this time, you are considered a cooperating witness. At this time. Not exactly comforting language. Still, witness was better than target. Far better. Nathan was already scribbling notes aggressively now. Agent Collins continued. We believe several internal objections were raised before Black Ridge received preliminary approval. They were, I said immediately. And do you possess documentation supporting those objections? I looked at the mountains of reports covering my kitchen table. Engineering warnings, vendor audits, inspection failures, email chains. Enough paperwork to bury 3 executives minimum. Yes, I answered calmly. I do. Good, Collins replied. Then came the sentence that finally confirmed how serious this situation had become. We strongly recommend preserving all communications involving Mr. Vaughn. Not Harborstone, not Black Ridge, Mr. Vaughn. Specific, targeted. Federal investigators were no longer examining theoretical risk. They were examining Derek personally. After the call ended, Nathan leaned back slowly. Well, he muttered, I think Derek's life just exploded. I stared silently at the dark apartment window, because somehow, despite everything Derek had already destroyed, I still don't think he understood how catastrophic this was about to become. And the worst part? Neither did the public. Not yet. But once federal investigators officially connected Harborstone to Blackridge, every leaked article, every deleted file, every override approval, every reckless decision Derek made trying to impress investors was about to become national news. By Tuesday morning, the story had officially exploded. Not inside Harborstone, nationwide. Every major business outlet picked it up after federal investigators confirmed Blackridge Manufacturing was tied to falsified infrastructure certifications. News anchors called it a potential industrial fraud network. Financial analysts started questioning how many companies could be connected. And unfortunately for Derek, Harborstone's name kept appearing beside Blackridge in every article. Nathan arrived at my apartment before sunrise carrying coffee and 3 newspapers. Actual newspapers, which honestly made the situation feel even worse somehow. "You're on the front page," he said. "Fantastic. Technically, Derek is too. That does improve things slightly." He dropped the papers onto the kitchen counter. Every headline looked uglier than the last. Federal inquiry expands into supplier network. Harborstone executive under scrutiny. Internal warnings ignored before investigation. I stared at the articles quietly, because this no longer felt like revenge or corporate drama. This felt dangerous. Nathan handed me coffee. Marcus called twice. "That's never good." "No, it really isn't." Before I could ask more, my phone started vibrating again. Marcus. I answered immediately. "Please tell me you're sitting down," he said. I exchanged a glance with Nathan. "I am now." Marcus exhaled heavily. "Federal investigators executed a warrant this morning." My stomach tightened instantly. "At Harborstone?" "No. Derek's house." The apartment went silent, because search warrants changed everything. That meant investigators believed they already had probable cause. This wasn't preliminary anymore. This was escalation. Nathan slowly lowered his coffee cup. "What did they take?" I asked carefully. "Computers, phones, financial records, external drives." Interesting. Very interesting. Because Derek always believed appearances mattered more than preparation, which meant if investigators searched his home, they probably already knew exactly what they were looking for. Marcus lowered his voice. "There's more." Of course there was. One of Derek's private accounts transferred money to a consulting firm connected to Blackridge. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The piece that finally made everything make sense. Because now, Derek's decisions stopped looking reckless. Now they looked profitable. Personally profitable. Nathan immediately grabbed a notepad. "How much?" "Over 400,000 across 6 months. Neither of us spoke for a second, because hidden payments completely changed the investigation. This wasn't just negligence anymore. This was potential corruption. Kickbacks. Fraud. Maybe worse. Marcus continued carefully. "Investigators think Blackridge may have been paying executives through shell consulting agreements." I leaned back slowly against the counter, and suddenly every terrible decision Derek made over the last 8 months became crystal clear. The supplier overrides, the buried inspection reports, the aggressive cost-cutting, the desperation to approve Blackridge despite repeated warnings. It wasn't ego, or not just ego. It was money. Nathan shook his head slowly. He destroyed his entire life for consulting payments. "No," I said quietly. "He destroyed it because he thought nobody would ever question him." That was the real problem with people like Derek. Success convinced them they were untouchable. smart enough to bypass rules, important enough to avoid consequences, and eventually, they stopped hiding their behavior carefully. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time, I already knew who it probably was. I answered carefully. "Ms. Mercer, this is Agent Collins again." Nathan immediately looked up. Collins sounded calmer than before, which somehow felt more intimidating. "We may need formal testimony regarding Mr. Vaughn's vendor approval activities." Formal testimony. Not interviews, not conversations. Testimony. Things were moving fast now. Very fast. Then Collins said something that made my entire body go cold. "We also recovered communications suggesting Mr. Vaughn anticipated your termination would remove internal resistance to Black Ridge approval." I stared silently at the apartment wall, because there it was. Proof. Derek didn't fire me over disagreements. He fired me because I was in the way. And suddenly, this stopped feeling like corporate revenge entirely. Now it felt like I'd accidentally survived something much worse. 2 weeks later, Derek Vaughn disappeared completely. No interviews, no statements, no angry LinkedIn posts pretending to be the victim of corporate politics. Nothing. Which honestly scared investors more than public outrage would have. Because silence usually meant attorneys were involved. Lots of attorneys. Harborstone's board entered full crisis control mode almost immediately. Emergency audits, compliance reviews, federal cooperation meetings. Every executive suddenly became obsessed with phrases like transparency and accountability. Funny how quickly people rediscover ethics once investigators start issuing warrants. By Friday afternoon, Marcus and I sat inside one of Harborstone's smaller conference rooms reviewing damage assessments. Not financial damage, trust damage, which was worse. Government contracts were frozen pending review. Several vendors paused negotiations. 2 investors demanded independent oversight before releasing additional capital. And despite everything, Harborstone was still standing. Barely. Marcus rubbed both hands across his face. "I still can't believe he thought this would work." "He didn't think he'd get caught," I replied. "That's not confidence anymore. That's insanity." Maybe. Or maybe power just changes people slowly enough they stop noticing. Because Derek didn't start at Harborstone acting reckless. At first, he was polished, careful, strategic. Then, quarterly profits rewarded bad behavior. Shortcuts saved money. Pressure worked. And eventually, he stopped seeing rules as limitations. He started seeing them as inconveniences. That was the dangerous part. Not greed. Certainty. The belief that success itself proved you were smarter than consequences. Marcus slid another report toward me. Federal investigators requested additional engineering documentation. I nodded slowly. At this point, half my apartment looked like an evidence warehouse anyway. Nathan had already organized everything into timelines, inspection failures, internal objections, deleted records. The deeper investigators dug, the worse Derek looked. And apparently, they were digging very deep. My phone buzzed against the conference table. Nathan. I answered immediately. "You're going to enjoy this," he said. "That usually means somebody else won't." "Correct." Marcus looked up instantly. "What happened?" I asked. Nathan sounded almost impressed. Federal investigators recovered deleted messages from Derek's private devices. Interesting. Very interesting. Because Derek always assumed deleting things solved problems. People like him misunderstood technology completely. Deleting evidence rarely erased it. It just created another trail investigators could recover later. "What kind of messages?" I asked carefully. Nathan laughed once. The kind prosecutors frame on office walls. That couldn't be good. He continued. There are direct discussions about pushing Blackridge approvals before internal opposition could interfere. My grip tightened around the phone. Internal opposition, meaning me. Again. Nathan lowered his voice. There's also evidence he expected your termination to clear operational resistance. Marcus actually swore under his breath. Because now the situation became impossible to spin. Derek didn't accidentally make reckless decisions. He knowingly removed people standing in his way. And once investigators established intent, everything changed. Then Nathan added one final sentence. Oh, and apparently Derek's trying to negotiate with investigators now. I frowned immediately. Interesting, because innocent executives usually hired lawyers. Desperate executives tried making deals. And suddenly, for the first time since this disaster started, I realized Derek Vaughn finally understood something terrifying. This was no longer about losing his job. Now he was trying not to lose everything else, too. 3 days later, Derek Vaughn was arrested. Not quietly, either. Federal agents detained him outside a downtown law office just after 9 in the morning. Someone recorded the entire thing from across the street. Within an hour, the video was everywhere online. The same executive who spent months lecturing employees about professionalism and discipline was now being guided into an SUV by federal investigators while reporters shouted questions at him from the sidewalk. Honestly, it didn't even feel satisfying at first. Just surreal. Marcus sent me the video before I'd even finished my coffee. No message attached. He didn't need one. I watched the clip once, then immediately turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter. Nathan noticed. You okay? Still deciding. Because this whole situation stopped feeling like revenge a while ago. Revenge was getting someone fired. This was watching someone destroy their own life in slow motion. Nathan sat across from me quietly. They charged him fast. How bad? He slid a tablet across the table. Unauthorized system access, evidence tampering, financial fraud conspiracy, obstruction related to federal procurement investigations. I stared at the screen silently. That was serious. Prison serious. Nathan leaned back slowly. Investigators think he started deleting records after hearing Blackridge was under federal review. Panic. Again. Every terrible decision Derek made near the end came from panic. Because arrogant people usually believe they can outsmart consequences, right up until consequences become criminal. Then, survival instincts take over. And survival made people sloppy. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus calling directly. I answered immediately. You're not going to believe this, he said. At this point, I'll believe almost anything. Marcus lowered his voice. Derek tried offering investigators names. Interesting. Very interesting. Because that meant he was negotiating aggressively now, trying to reduce exposure, trying to survive. Whose names? Board contacts, vendors, consultants. I frowned. Anyone important? No, Marcus replied immediately. Mostly people he thought he could sacrifice. That tracked perfectly. Even now, Derek still believed relationships were transactional, useful until they stopped protecting him, then disposable. Marcus continued. The investigators apparently weren't impressed. I almost smiled at that. Because men like Derek spent so long manipulating corporate environments, they forgot something important. Federal investigators weren't employees. They didn't care about titles, or charisma, or executive confidence. They cared about evidence. and Derek had left evidence everywhere. Nathan checked another update on his laptop. Oh, this gets better. That sentence worries me now. Apparently, Derek blamed you during questioning. I laughed once before I could stop myself. Of course he did. How? Nathan scrolled through the article. He claimed you orchestrated internal resistance to sabotage his leadership initiatives. Marcus actually laughed through the phone this time, because at this point the accusation sounded ridiculous, especially after investigators recovered deleted communications discussing my termination directly. Derek wasn't losing because of me. He was losing because every shortcut he took left fingerprints behind. Eventually, those fingerprints formed a trail, and eventually that trail led directly back to him. Marcus suddenly went quiet. Then he asked something unexpected. Do you ever feel bad for him? Interesting question. I thought about it honestly. The ruined career, the public humiliation, the handcuffs, the investigations, the fact his entire future now depended on federal negotiations happening behind closed doors. Then I remembered the buried safety warnings, the hospital contracts, the employees he intimidated into silence. The fact he fired me specifically because I stood between him and Blackridge. And most importantly, the fact none of this stopped until people with power finally intervened. No, I said calmly. I think he earned this. Nathan slowly nodded beside me, and for the first time in weeks, the apartment finally felt quiet again. 1 year later, Harborstone posted the strongest operational recovery in company history. Not because we discovered some revolutionary strategy, not because of aggressive restructuring, and definitely not because somebody gave a motivational speech about innovation. We recovered because we stopped pretending short-term greed was leadership. Turns out, that helped quite a bit. The federal investigation eventually expanded far beyond Derek Vaughn. Blackridge Manufacturing collapsed completely 6 months after the arrests started. Executives disappeared. Consultants vanished. Several shell companies dissolved almost overnight. And once investigators started following financial transfers, everything unraveled. Derek eventually accepted a plea agreement. Nathan called me the day it became official. He took the deal, he said immediately. What kind of deal? Enough cooperation to avoid the worst charges. Interesting. Not surprising, though, because Derek always cared more about survival than loyalty. Even at the end. Especially at the end. I stared out the window of my office while Harborstone employees moved through the production floor below. Busy. Focused. Normal. Something the company hadn't felt in a very long time. How much time? I asked. Nathan exhaled quietly. Several years. Not enough to destroy his life completely, but enough to permanently define it. And honestly, that felt strangely appropriate, because Derek's real punishment wasn't prison, it was exposure. The collapse of the image he spent his entire career building. The brilliant executive, the modern leader, the untouchable operator who thought confidence mattered more than competence. In the end, all it took to destroy that image was evidence. Marcus eventually became CEO officially, a decision the board somehow described as unexpected, which was funny considering Marcus had basically been carrying the company's financial integrity on his back for years. The first thing he did after accepting the role? Restore the engineering oversight budget Derek cut. The second? Rehire half the compliance staff pushed out during restructuring. Funny how quickly companies rediscover common sense after nearly becoming federal case studies. As for me, I stayed. That surprised people. Several investors assumed I'd step away after everything that happened. Honestly, I considered it. For about a week. Then one morning, I walked through the manufacturing floor and noticed something strange. People looked relaxed again. Engineers argued openly during meetings without fear. Supervisors stopped whispering before speaking. Employees who spent months terrified of retaliation suddenly acted like professionals again instead of hostages. That mattered more than I expected, because Harborstone was never just numbers on reports to me. My grandfather saved this company decades earlier because he believed stable businesses protected communities, jobs, families, entire towns sometimes. And somewhere along the way, executives like Derek forgot that. To them, companies became scoreboards, quarterly targets, personal branding opportunities. But real businesses aren't PowerPoint slides. They're people. And people pay the price when arrogance reaches leadership positions. The strangest part? I still get messages about Derek sometimes. Former executives, industry gossip, people asking if the story was exaggerated, if anyone could really be arrogant enough to fire the majority owner of a company without realizing it. And honestly, I understand why people doubt it, because it sounds ridiculous. But arrogance does strange things to intelligent people. It convinces them titles matter more than competence, that loud confidence equals authority, that the people quietly fixing problems beneath them are somehow invisible. Derek thought my employee badge was the reason I belonged in that building. He never realized I was one of the reasons the building still stood. And maybe that was his biggest mistake. Not the fraud, not the shortcuts, not even the corruption. It was underestimating the people he believed were beneath him. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together.